Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality.
Well, hello, Shattered Reality listeners. This is Fahrusha here, and today is December 4th, 2018. And once again, Kate Valentine is not with us. However, I have recently spoken to her, and she is just fine, and she's looking forward to coming back to the show. So, today, I wanted to start out with a little bit of a hello to somebody out in Athens, Ohio, who is a friend of mine named Paula Lockhart. Paula, if you are listening, I wanted to thank you very much for recommending today's guest. Today's podcast is number 79, for those of you who are keeping track of our numbers. But Paula went to a lecture in Athens, Ohio, where she lives, and she came across this amazing woman who has written 3 books on history and literature. She herself, I believe, is a journalist and a professor of at a university here, Ohio University. Perhaps she'll correct me exactly the name of where she is teaching. But she has written 3 books, one of which is Never Seen the Moon, The Trials of Edith Maxwell. And she's also co-edited An American Vein, Critical Readings in Appalachian Literature. She lives in Athens, Ohio, and the book that we are going to discuss today is called Enchanted Ground, The Spirit Room of Jonathan Koons. So let's welcome to Shattered Reality, Sharon Hatfield. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Fahrusha. It's great to be on your program today. I'm eager to talk about Jonathan Koons. He's been an obsession of mine for many years.
Okay. Well, before we get into Mr. Koons, let's hear a little bit more about you. So, how did you come to Athens, Ohio? How did you start out with this interest?
Well, I've always been a curious person. I loved school, I loved reading and speculating about things. As a child, I was drawn to fairy tales. I loved Nancy Drew mysteries. And then as a grown up, I did become a journalist. I did work in newspapers for a while, and now I just work on my own, writing about things that interest me. And in 2010, living here in Athens, Ohio, I decided that I would like to look more into the story of Jonathan Koons, who was a spiritualist who lived here in our county in the 1850s. And the reason that I got interested in Jonathan was because at Halloween, the local papers would do a roundup of spooky stories from Athens County, Ohio. And they would usually mention Koons because not only did he have seances that drew hundreds, if not thousands of people to his remote homestead, but supposedly these seances had musical accompaniment by the spirit.
Okay. Well, that is quite fascinating, and I just wanted to say here at Shattered Reality, we are very, very interested in all aspects of the paranormal and parapsychology, and most of all, consciousness. So at the beginning, you state that you are not going to comment on the veracity, not going to judge, and I think that is extremely astute on your part, and you could become the anthropologist as well as the journalist by doing this. It's hard enough to decide about events that you're present for, like the reality of events that you're actually in the room for. And Then you extrapolate one step farther and talk to people in the current realm, people who are still alive, and they will relate to you certain experiences that they might have. And then you have to, I don't mean you, Sharon, have to, but one has to decide, well, how do I feel about that? Is that true? Is that false? Um, and then we have to look back into the past, as you are doing with this, where no one is alive anymore from the 1850s, which is the basic error that your story, Enchanted Ground, takes place. So I think that it's very astute of you not to judge. How did you come to that decision not to judge the veracity?
Well, I had to take off my usual journalistic hat and put on a hat, more of a historian of religion. And because I realized that when you're talking about mental events, like spiritual experiences, that you can't really judge a mental event as to whether, if someone said, I heard a voice talking to me or I saw a vision and it really meant a lot to me, then I think you have to respect the person's report and not try to decide if that's real or unreal. On the other hand, I do think it's kind of interesting to try to figure out exactly what went on at a seance without judging it.
Excellent, excellent. Your historical aspects in this book are extraordinarily well researched. Many people don't learn the intricacies of the history of the United States, just an overview, basically, where you hear about the wars, the presidents, the laws passed, but not the spiritual zeitgeist of the people. And I kind of feel like you really delved into that aspect, making the history not only of Athens, Ohio, but the whole um, the whole region. You made it a lot more understandable to people than a high school history text would.
Well, I know that I was never taught anything about religious history much at all in school. So this was a great learning experience for me. And what I learned is that the times that the people were living in the 1850s, right before the Civil War, was in a way a lot like our times today, a very deeply divided country and a country that was shaken to the core by technological advances. And people were really looking for something that they could believe in and hang on to. And also, they really wanted to get away from this Calvinistic notion that of hellfire and brimstone was going to be rained down on the large majority of the people, and only the elect would be spared. And they really were looking to spiritualism as a more positive, more progressive way of seeing not only this world, but the afterlife.
Well, yeah, I would certainly agree that there were um, aspects of the story that you wrote that reflected the divisions in today's life. I'm going to skip ahead to just one thing, and I don't want to get too far ahead on the story, but being as you had mentioned that, I was thinking last night so much as I was reviewing my notes about at the point at which some person or persons burned his barn down. And I just, that reminded me of a lot of violence that goes on today. And it sort of seems to me as though I can, now, I'm not a violent person, but I certainly can understand, you know, if you rape my sister, then I go and beat you up to a bloody pulp. But I don't have a sister and nobody's been raped. But you get where I'm going with that. That is an understandable animal reaction. But it's so hard for me to understand people getting so fired up over differences in spiritual thought, that they would go in there and burn the man's barn down when he hadn't done anything to them except for, have a gathering at his home, which it would seem to me that in the Bill of Rights, you're allowed to do that, right?
Yes, you're allowed to assemble and you're also allowed to worship according to the First Amendment, however you choose to worship. However, there was a lot of intolerance then, as there is now, and mainstream Christianity was the prevalent religion, not only of our area, but of the United States. And a lot of the, well, not a lot, but at least some of the folks thought that Jonathan Koons was worshiping the devil.
Mm,
He was not. The devil was not a part of his theology,
no.
but under this conception that they did torch his barn just a few months after he had started the spirit room.
Wow. Well, let's move more towards the beginning of the story. And he started out in a community in Pennsylvania, and his father spoke of a mysterious light traversing the ridge in that community where he had started out in Pennsylvania. And it sounds to me like that would be very, very similar to today's accounts of UFOs and orbs.
Well, that's a very interesting point, which I really hadn't thought of, but I guess I had thought more like in terms of the swamp gas or something like that, but I think it's certainly open to many different interpretations. And so his father, Peter Kuntz, was a Presbyterian farmer there in Bedford County, Pennsylvania. But interestingly enough, he also, according to Jonathan, had certain healing powers, and he was part of the Pennsylvania Dutch powwow tradition, where it was a Christian tradition, but it goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, and they believed that they could heal people through chanting and sort of invoking the divine.
Yes, it's a very. I've spoken to some folks um, about this powwow tradition, and I think that it's necessary for us to state that although powwow we consider in the United States for the most part to be a group of Native Americans getting together for a meeting, which would be called a powwow also. A powwow, the Pennsylvania Dutch powwow, really comes from an old medieval German tradition. Is that correct?
I believe it is, and you're certainly wise to point out that it doesn't have anything to do with Native Americans. It's more of what I would call white magic going back to Europe.
Indeed, and some people have the ability to stop bleeding in this manner, and it takes a belief, a strong, positive belief, to make it work, from my understanding. Now, Jonathan Koons, as a boy, his meditations took him places. He had liminal state adventures. Liminal state meaning that excuse me, that he traveled in the time prior to falling asleep, and then hypnopompic, I believe it's called, when you're just waking up. But liminal state for me works for either. Now, some of these adventures were very similar to today's out of body experiences. And what might you say about those meditations that he did before, when he was still in Bedford, Pennsylvania area?
Well, first he had a spiritual crisis because, and I can really identify with this myself, but he had a spiritual crisis when he was a little boy because he literally believed that he was going to go to hell because that he could not be perfect enough, that he was always going to be sinful. And so he fell into a deep melancholy, and his family actually became worried about him because he wasn't able to snap out of it. And finally, he saw a vision of angel or an older figure that took him through the realms of heaven. And this is the thing that cured him and was able to bring him out of his very depressed state. But it also helped him start meditating on a regular basis. And Jonathan Koons called it painting on his visionary canvases. But I feel that his getting into meditation and what you may call out of body experiences at a young age, I feel that that really set the stage later for him to become a medium.
I believe so too, because the ability to have liminal state experiences would make other psychic functioning more probable. I'm trying to draw some correlation in a few places to things that would work in the modern day vocabulary, just so people who are listening to this and who might want to read your book would get a picture of how it relates to today's, like, sort of, shall we say, New Age spirituality. I don't really like the term New Age, but that kind of gives an idea.
Yeah, there is a relationship between the mediumistic practices they had and then the channeling that came later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So basically, could you just tell us in Bedford, Pennsylvania, in today's Bedford County, Pennsylvania, what is the main city or town?
Bedford.
Bedford. Okay, good enough. So he left Pennsylvania and traveled with his new wife to Ohio to live. Do you wanna speak to that a little bit?
Sure. He actually hadn't met her yet. His wife Abigail. He met her after he got to Athens County. But the reason he moved was because the same reason a lot of people moved west. They wanted cheap land. The population was exploding, and they had to keep having more room. And of course, that meant displacing the Native Americans. But by the time Jonathan came over to Athens County from Bedford in 1835, the Indians had already been run out of our area. And he came and bought a couple hundred acres of land on top of a ridge. And I call that Mount Nebo in the story, which
Yes.
it was later called Mount Nebo. It wasn't called that at the time, but it's just a more descriptive term. He built a farmhouse there, and he found a wife who was a lady from New Hampshire named Abigail Bishop, and they got married after a summer romance in 1836, and they eventually moved to this hilltop farm. And for the first decade or 15 years of their marriage, it was totally conventional as far as I can tell, except that Jonathan had become an infidel. He had lost his religion, and he wasn't a churchgoer at that point. And in 1852, he says that he converted to spiritualism. And his wife was very supportive of his efforts, despite the fact that Abigail was the daughter of a Baptist minister.
Huh.
So, yeah, so he was really attracted to Abigail because he said that she was a free thinker. And so they had a life together. They had 10 biological children and one adopted child. And they settled in as farmers. But soon, as soon as they started spiritualism, things really changed.
I wanna pause for a second because I want to get right into that, but I want to pause for a second to tell you to speak to the Johnny Appleseed part of the story, simply because Johnny Appleseed to me was always a fascinating character, and no one in the general history books ever said anything about him being a Swedenborgian mystic himself. And so he just fascinated me because he was a vegetarian and he did plant many, many apple trees in the United States. Though in my memory, I didn't remember exactly where he had planted them. But do you want to speak to that just a little bit? Because I think it's a fascinating correlation to the times of Jonathan Koons and Johnny Appleseed, also known as John Chapman, was practicing at the same time, and it's quite possible, even probable, that they met one another.
Well, the Swedenborgian aspect of the story is very interesting to me because a lot of the spiritualists took part of their philosophy from Swedenborg. He was a Swedish scientist and also, as you said, a mystic. One of his most famous exploits as a mystic was when he was over in Sweden and he was hundreds of miles from his home in Stockholm. And yet he saw a vision that the city was on fire and that his own house was almost about to be consumed by the flames. Luckily, it was spared. But he was able to relate this story at a dinner party as it was occurring, and it took a couple of days for any couriers to come from Stockholm to tell anyone the news about the fire. And so Swedenborg's ideas came over to the United States, and there was a group of followers who started the Church of the New Jerusalem. And Johnny Appleseed was a very devoted follower of this brand of mystical Christianity. And he, after he left the East Coast, he lived in Ohio for quite some time. And he would go get seeds and plant trees and also sort of anticipate where the frontier would be moving on. And so he was not only a businessman selling the apple trees, but he was going around spreading his brand of religion. And he called it good news because he felt that it was giving people more control over their own destiny instead of this dark, gloomy picture.
And he did travel around in the same area of Ohio where Jonathan Koons and his family lived at the same time. Is that true?
There is some overlap there. You're absolutely right, because Jonathan moved in 1835 to Athens County, and Johnny Appleseed did not move to Indiana until 1845. They could have overlapped, and it's certainly documented that Johnny Appleseed did travel through Athens County.
Okay. Well, that is an interesting correlation. Now we get to the part where up in Rochester, I think it was, New York, the was it Rochester that the Fox sisters? Do I have the right town? Probably not. Where the Fox sisters were practicing their rapping, their
Yes.
table rapping, and this kind of became a very prominent feature of spiritualist gatherings for quite some time. So much so that there was a young lady in the neighborhood of Jonathan Koons named Mary Jane Paston,
Mm-hmm.
who was working there as a rapper, and I I use that term simply because it's a little humorous in terms of today's thoughts about rappers being musicians who speak poetry in rhythmical ways today. So Mary Jane Paston, in some way, inspired Jonathan Koons. Yes.
Well, she was a very pivotal figure in his life because at that point he was very skeptical of the spiritualism movement, and he was determined to be a debunker. So it's very much like the story in Christianity of Saul on the road to Damascus where he's converted. Jonathan Koons went to the seance that was conducted by Mary Jane Paston, and he went there thinking he would show what a fraud everything was. And instead, he was told that he was going to become a great medium and that others in his family would become mediums as well. And so his skepticism quickly dissolves and he starts an apprenticeship to learn the mediumistic skills.
Well, that is extremely interesting that he sort of was converted towards spiritualism at the gatherings. But Mary Jane, she stopped performing her rapping after a point, um, and uh, and Jonathan Koons began his. I have to ask you, he was a very prolific fellow. He had 10 children, and how many of those lived to adulthood?
Well, he had a daughter, Felinia, who died when she was 12 years old of a heart condition. And then later on, he had a 14-year-old son who died of typhoid and an adopted girl who died of typhoid. So 8 of them lived to be adults.
And I have to ask you about one of the names. The names were very unusual to me, and not unheard of, but one was like blew my mind, which was a boy named Cinderellus.
Isn't that amazing? I don't know where they came up with these names. They are quite unusual, even for that time period, I think.
I think so. And the Cinderellus just blew me away because I can't help thinking of the fairy tale of Cinderella, which I think was sort of not cleansed, but cleaned up, I would say, by the Walt Disney people, that Cinderella was really a French folk tale of from the past. Do you know much about that, or is that something that we should just move past? But I was kind of blown away by that nickname or that given name of a young man, Cinderellus, and wondered if it had any correlation to the actual original French folk tale of Cinderella.
I will have to defer to you on that one, Fahrusha. I'm really not familiar with the background or how he got the name, but I would mention another son, the oldest son. His name was from the Bible, Nahum, but instead of pronouncing it Nahum, they pronounced it Nim as if it were Nim.
Oh,
And this young man, Nim, was a principal medium at the seances. And he was supposed to be the standout talent of all the children. And usually, if he were absent for some reason, usually not very much happened.
I see. So um, he was considered to be uh, actually even more powerful a medium than his father.
Yes, I believe so. Although Jonathan was extremely creative. I could tell you just a little bit about how the seances went, and you can see how that he really innovated. He moved so far beyond rapping. Would you like for me to just kind of tell you the layout
Sure,
of?
sure. Go right ahead.
Well, Jonathan built a room, a log cabin beside of his home, and dedicated it just for the seances. It was a single room, about 12 feet by 16 feet, and they would shut it up very tightly to where no light could come in, and the seances would be conducted in pitch dark. Jonathan would start out with a candle, and he also would play the fiddle. He would blow out the candle, he would start playing the fiddle, and other instruments would join in. So the audience is experiencing all this in the dark. So they're hearing things a lot more than they're seeing them. They also had a trumpet that supposedly levitated, and this voice would come through the trumpet and sometimes just engage in light banter with the audience, but many times he would give sermons. And this spiritual guide that came through the trumpet was known as King, King. And so these seances were very lively, very entertaining, and people flocked to uh, experience this. Sometimes there were waiting lists. Now, one other aspect of the seance that was the most spectacular effect was disembodied hands. They called them spectral hands. And they would come out and write messages to people in the audience. And the way that these hands could be seen was that Jonathan Koons would make up a phosphorus solution that could be used to illuminate the hand.
Well, that is kind of typical, in fact, of many gatherings of this sort of what we would call physical mediums. Now, the thing that I would mention here is that you had said that perhaps Koons was the actual developer of the spiritualist trumpet, which is still in use today in spiritualist circles, the idea of this sort of speaking trumpet.
Yes, he's considered the innovator of the trumpet. He's about the first one that it was reported on in the spiritualist press that used that particular device. Now, the hands, we're not sure where that first manifested, but one of the most interesting stories to me came from England, where the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning is attending a seance by a man named D.D. Hume.
Oh, yes.
And a hand comes up and lays a garland on her head at the seance, and she's so astonished that she writes a letter to her sister and documents it.
Well, D.D. Hume is perhaps one of the most famous people in terms of parapsychological history. But the difference, the one thing that, and you bring this out in the book, it's not that I'm outing Mr. Koons here, but D.D. Hume did all his stuff in the light, and he was critical of people who performed in the dark. Now, he was of Scottish background, I believe, but he was an orphan, and he lived a lot of his life in the Hudson Valley, I believe, of the United States. But he was seen to levitate on more than one occasion, to go out one window of a building and come in the next. And he is really, really very, very well known, but he did criticize those mediums who worked in the dark, did he not?
Absolutely. He believed that was only going to draw suspicion to the movement and that it was not a good way to go.
I'm a big admirer of Mr. Hume because of his levitation. And I find the idea of levitation incredibly interesting. We have had guests on who have written about famous levitators, and it's just a very, very amazing feat. And I'm not talking about the Indian yogis who sort of pop up out of a lotus position, which in itself is quite a feat to be able to hop in a lotus position, and they sometimes consider that to be levitation. But I'm thinking more of some of the Spanish and Italian mystics within the Catholic Church.
Well, this was one thing that Koons never claimed to do. He never claimed to do the levitation. But getting back to Hume, he also was reported to have been able to handle hot coals without getting burned, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yes, it absolutely is, and that is something that a lot of people, not handling hot coals, but running across hot coals, people apparently, and I'm not one of them, can be trained to walk across or run across hot coals without burning their feet, as long as they maintain the right frame of mind. But as soon as they experience fear and other negative emotions, they seem to get burned. And I know that people teach others how to do this in one place in Hawaii as well as other places around the U.S. and elsewhere. So, yes, D.D. Hume was a very, very interesting character and one of the few people who did levitate outside of a church sort of setting. In any case, I made several trips, actually two I'm thinking of specifically, to the general area of Athens, Ohio. And I have been very, very aware in my visits and visited mounds, the mound builders, things in nearby West Virginia and in Ohio, and have had some very mystical experiences of my own in that area that I'm not planning to go into right at the moment, but at a certain point in your book, you do mention that that the mineral components of that area may have been thought to contribute to the outbursts of all this mediumistic phenomena.
Yes, I actually set the book up in 3 braids. I call them braids. And one of them is talking about what spiritualism is or was. The second one is just telling the story of what happened to Koons and his family. But the third braid deals with using the location of Athens County, Ohio, as a character. And this is where we get into the idea of the enchanted ground. Why did people think that this area had special conductivity, you might say, of spirits? And this is an idea that goes way back into the 1850s. It's not a current or contemporary idea at all. And I think Koons had a lot to do with starting this idea because people somehow got the notion that his farm, the area around it, the rocks, the trees, the soil itself was somehow more conducive to drawing spirits. Now, we haven't scientifically proven that idea, but it is part of the lore and heritage of our area.
Well, it seems to me that there has been in modern times some people who have studied electromagnetic properties of certain places, and Persinger, who recently died, had this Persinger's helmet that he would put on people that stimulated their brains with electromagnetic impulses, and they would have, in fact, paranormal experiences. So it could be that some of the minerals in the earth, particularly quartz, and we do know, of course, that quartz has been used for many years in radios, for instance, so that it does have some very unusual properties beyond the spiritual properties of people wearing a piece of quartz around their neck for protection or something of that nature. So there is those electromagnetic properties in boulder fields and quartz particularly. And he also had built a table of some sort. Would you like to speak to that for a moment?
Sure. But let me just add on to what you just
Sure,
said.
sure.
I think it would make a fascinating study for someone to look into. Is there a scientific basis for, certain areas being like hot spots? And I was at a meeting of the SSE a few years ago, Society for Scientific Exploration.
Yes, yes.
I asked one of the researchers there if she thought that there were areas that were more conducive to psychic or paranormal activity. She said she did believe it, and she called them epipathic zones. And I have tried to research that. I've never found anything on it, but I think it would be a fascinating study.
Well,
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to speak to that. I'm a member of the SSE as well as Kate is. She's not here, but we're both members of that society, and it's a wonderful
Yeah.
organization. But beyond that, let's just look at people do go missing in boulder fields across the country, go missing and sometimes are never ever found again. And in Iceland and other Scandinavian countries, uh, people don't move these big boulders. In fact, they will still build roads around the boulders because they believe that these huge boulders are homes to elves and fairy folk, gnomes. There are different words for these only quasi-physical entities, shall we call them. So it's not particularly a novel idea, but it is an idea that certainly needs more research to it.
Yes, indeed. And now I shall try to answer your question about the machine.
Okay, good.
Jonathan Koons built what he called a spirit machine or retaining battery. Those Victorian spiritualists loved their machines. And he had started with a table that was rectangular in shape, a wooden table. He built a frame on the top of the table, a sort of a curved wooden frame, and he attached metal plates to it and little bells and all kinds of wires. And then he put a bass drum on one side of the frame and a tenor drum on the other side of the frame. And he said that the spirits would charge this machine and that it would cause them to be able to focus their energies in a more concentrated manner. Now, others who visited there said that it was not able to conduct electricity and that it was simply a piece of furniture.
Hmm.
I tried to look into this further and I contacted a gentleman who deals in antique furniture in Ohio. He's on many shows dealing with antiques, and he said that he had never seen one. He had never seen a machine like that.
Hmm. Well, I must admit that I have not seen such a machine, but I do know that lots of people do construct machines of sorts that try to collect ambient electrical energy through the use of copper wires and the like. So it's not a totally one-off kind of situation. So you had mentioned that you use the you use the term spiritualist society of the day. Do you think spiritualism has changed very much in the intervening years?
That's a really great question. I don't really pretend to be an authority on the modern day. I've focused more on the historical. Now, I visited Lilydale, New York as part of my research, and I also visited Cassadaga, Florida as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe the main difference that I have seen, and you may be able to comment on this, Fahrusha, is that the physical mediumship is not allowed anymore, or it's
It's not
frowned upon
encouraged. Yeah.
because the potential for fraud that does exist there.
What I would say to that is I visited both of those places and I liked them both. They were very nice. I do not consider myself a card carrying member of any spiritualist per se organization, though the I respect the religion as it stands. But in Europe, particularly in England, there is still a lot of physical mediumship going on, apparently.
Interesting. Very interesting.
And I did mention to you in a brief conversation we had prior to this podcast that there is a gentleman named Dr. James McLennan, and he has written a book called The Entity Letters, uh, which was published by Anomalous Books, and we did interview him, and there were a lot of physical manifestations going on in the Midwest with this group that was that he wrote about in the Entity Letters that centered around the spirituality of I'm trying to think of the gentleman's name now, John Niebuhr, who wrote Black Elk Speaks. I can't think of the end of his last name, but he wrote the book Black Elk Speaks, which was a spiritual book involving Native Americans as well. And the people who gathered in a circle for many years, they did experience a lot of physical manifestations. So, moving on from there, would you like to go forward with the story of Jonathan Koons and what happened to him? I know that he visited New York and he did make some moves in his life, and maybe we'll kind of finish up with that.
Absolutely. Jonathan Koons ran the spirit room next to his home in Athens County, Ohio, for about 3.5 years. And it's important to realize that he was not charging admission. And this was what, to me, made him all the more fascinating as a character. The mediums on the East Coast, some of them were making, well, the Fox sisters were reported to be making $150 a day. And I know can be a difference of opinion about that, but he did not charge admission, but he did accept donations. And he and his wife were kind of going broke because they had so many visitors would come there, and some of them would really take advantage of the Koonses, and they would come and they would just make the scene and stay there for months at a time. And this was quite a drain on the family's resources because let's not forget the Koonses were farmers, so they farmed all day long to support the 10 children. And then probably 5 nights a week they were having to stay on. I'm just guessing. They were very frequent. And so this began to wear on them after a while. And they actually had freeloaders come there, and they had a term for it, spiritual mountebanks.
Oh, my.
Sometimes they would have to kind of run people off in a nice way when they were eating them out of house and home. But Jonathan and his wife were very hospitable, and so they were very kind in dealing with strangers from all that I have read. However, they also became under a lot of criticism. The spiritualists believed that it was important to police the movement. They thought that if you suspected fraudulent activity, you should report it because that would keep the movement more pure.
Uh-huh.
And so there were some debunkers that came to see Koons and went away and published negative stories. Most of the stories that visitors wrote, and we have many visitor accounts, thank goodness, most of them were very positive. People were very inspired and joyful by what they had experienced. But the debunkers did begin to wear and tear on the Koons family. And so after about the end of 1855, Jonathan shut down the spirit room, and he and his family went on the road with their mediumistic performances. So they went to Central Ohio, they went to Cleveland, on out the shore there of Lake Erie, and eventually, as you said, to New York City. But they were never as successful on the road as they were back home. And so Emma Harding Britton, the historian of the spiritualist movement, she gave a lot of space in one of her books to Koons, and she feels that that their powers waned for 2 reasons. And one reason was the location wasn't as conducive once they got away from their hills and forests. And her second reason was that the children were getting older. And you can interpret this two ways. One, they were getting older. They did not want to continue the seances. That was mom and dad's thing. And so they got away from it. Or you can interpret it maybe in terms of poltergeist activity, which
Oh,
is more
yes.
common with the teenagers.
Right.
So just to finish up on that, Koons did move to Illinois in 1858, and he remained a spiritualist his entire life. He no longer did the public performances, but he wrote regularly to the Religio Philosophical Journal in Chicago, and he even wrote a very hard to read book about his beliefs on Christianity.
Well, that is very, very interesting, and I wanted to make a correction right now and say that Black Elk Speaks was written by John G. Nyhard, and I was conflating his name with Reinhold Niebuhr or something like that. So a little bit of confusion there. But what I would like you to do now is to please tell people where they can get your book, who publishes it, and give yourself a little commercial there, please, Sharon.
The book is Enchanted Ground, The Spirit Room of Jonathan Koons. It's available at your neighborhood bookstore, or you can get it from Swallow Press website, which is part of Ohio University Press in Athens, Ohio. It's also available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and those large booksellers.
Well, I'm sorry if I mischaracterized you as teaching at Ohio University, but I thought they mostly published people who were actually actively teaching there. So that's quite a feather in your cap, so to speak, that they are publishing you and you're not a teacher there, correct?
Well, I'm retired from college teaching. I did teach there as recently as 2016. I
Oh,
taught
okay.
part-time, but now I'm just writing and enjoying my retirement.
So, what are you writing about now?
Well, I'm sort of taking a breather from writing and just traveling, promoting my book, and I have so many ideas, but it's a real huge commitment of time to start on another nonfiction work. So I think I might just do some shorter articles while I'm figuring out my next big project.
Well, that sounds like a very good idea. Um, what I was going to say in closing was that I was also impressed by the fact that Jonathan Koons didn't charge any admission to his spirit room, and though he did charge board, I believe once in a while when people would stay there, he was often not paid,
Right.
unfortunately. However, I'm not against people getting paid for the work they do. People do have to live, they do have to eat. There are different situations, but that particularly would contraindicate the idea of a complete fraudulent operation, wouldn't you say?
Yes, he was very sincere in his efforts to convince people of the soul's immortality. Even if he did perform some of the illusions or manifestations himself, he truly did believe that he could help people have a more joyful outlook on life. He wanted people to appreciate their own divine nature and find their own voice.
Well, that's quite beautiful. Now, and furthermore, in closing, I'm going to ask you what, even though you didn't state an opinion, having studied it for so long, what is your point of view on such things? You are an SSE member or were an SSE member, and what is your point of view about things of this nature?
I just believe that we need to expand our scientific paradigm to include these types of experiences. Everything that happens in this world cannot be duplicated in a lab. Now, I know that parapsychology has made some advances. I know you've had Brenda Dunn on your show
Oh,
talking
yes.
these things, but I just think that we need to work up a scientific paradigm that includes consciousness, because there's very many well documented experiences that can't be duplicated in a lab, but yet we know that they do exist.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I am a person who myself doesn't hold the concept that consciousness is merely a product of the brain, but more that the brain is a transceiver or a transmitter of consciousness. So it's very hard to study this because we're studying it with our brains and looking at it through the viewpoint of consensus reality. But that gets into a far longer discussion than we probably have time for here. But I would like to thank you very much for joining us today here on Shattered Reality Podcast. Do you have anything that you want to say to close up?
Just thank you so much for taking interest in my work. I really appreciate having the chance to talk with you. And if you come back to Ohio, let's go visit an Indian mound. That would be really cool.
Oh, I agree. I agree. And I have visited two different sets of mounds, two different times. The last time was this past summer when I did end up visiting our mutual friend, Miss Paula Lockhart. And I did visit a mound in Ohio, a group of mounds that was really very, very powerful. Now, I kind of understand that these mounds may be prior to the Native American, may have been constructed prior to the Native American peoples coming there, the ones that we knew lived there, like I believe it was basically the Shawnee that lived in that basic area. Is that true?
Yes, Shawnee and Delaware's, I think.
Okay. Okay, so the actual persons who constructed those mounds were a different group, but I believe that the Native American people were very respectful of those mounds, and I wish that the settlers, the people who came in, were as respectful of the mounds, because we would have a lot more of them now if they were. But
So true. So true.
that's that's just an opinion. Well, thank you so much, Sharon, for joining us. This has been very interesting for me, and I agree. Let's all get together back in Athens, Ohio, when I come out to visit again.
We'll invite Paula to go with us.
Okay. All
Hey,
right. Thank you so much, and bye for now.
bye-bye.
Well, friends, that was our latest installment of Shattered Reality Podcast. That was Sharon Hatfield, her book Enchanted Ground, The Spirit Room of Jonathan Koons, and it is published by Swallow Press of Athens, Ohio. And she was just a very hospitable guest. I would like to remind all of you to like us on Facebook, join us on shatteredrealitypodcast.com and shatteredrealitypodcast.wordpress.com, and on YouTube. We have a Shattered Reality Podcast channel there. We are available on iTunes and on Stitcher. And please like us on any and all of those different venues. I would really appreciate it. Now, I have gotten some requests for people who want to come on as guests. And we do have a backlog of people who want to be on as guests because we basically do 2 shows a month, unlike some podcasts that do a show every week. We don't do quite so many shows, but I appreciate all the listeners' suggestions, and I hope to get around to all the worthy people out there who have written or talked or exhibited paranormal interest. And I guess we're about to say goodbye from Shattered Reality.